Oh,吓死我了, that was scary, guys. I'm scared. Hey guys, welcome back to another mouse review. Today we have the Razer Deathadder V3 Pro. So I'm sure a lot of you have been waiting for a review on this. I wasn't really going to do one of these either until I decided that, hey, I'm going to try an Ergo again. This is very nostalgic to me because the Razer Deathadder was the first ever gaming mouse I had. I had the 2012 edition that only did blue lights, and the sensor went up to something in the 3000 DPI range. So this was a long time ago, right? Razer started doing RGB and green colorway in 2013, so I had the version even before that. Shout out to the boy Anto for hooking me up with this. He had this, he didn't really use it anymore, so he sold it to me for a really cheap price, so much appreciated. And without further ado, let's jump straight into it. So, I'm going to skip most of the unboxing and details. As you guys would already know, this is a Razer 30K sensor, does 4K polling if you have the 4K polling dongle. It's got optical switches, and it's 63 grams. But the one thing I do quite like is that Razer has actually upgraded their packaging since the last time I opened one of their products. And I like the fact that this thing comes in like a box like this, and you open it up, it's got two components. One's got all the flat things like the cards, the warranty, the booklet, grips, and all of that. And the other one is the cable. Pretty nice upgrade. I think the whole thing looks a lot more premiumly packaged now. Obviously, you got the dongle up the top there as well. So the build quality on this mouse is surprisingly good to my experience. I have not had any problems with it, no creaking, no squeezing. It feels really solid and sturdy. However, people have reported that they get squeaks on their Deathadder V3s. Hasn't happened to me yet, but I do know it's been reported, so take that as you will. Grips and coating. As you can see, I have put the CorePads grips on them as well as the CorePad skates like I always do. Now, this mouse has perhaps the worst stock coating I have ever touched, and I could not use this mouse with the stock coating whatsoever. I can't tell you if that is a coating issue or if that's a coating and mouse shape and grip issue, which we'll talk about later, but essentially, you have to get grips to make this work, or at least that is my experience. Now, I played with the stock grips for about a week, and they were passable. Not ideal, they were passable, but at least it worked better. Do get the CorePad grips. Just get grips, guys. Just get grips. So for sensor, when I first looked at this, I was like, oh, the sensor looks a bit further down. It's probably going to be a pretty mid sensor placement. I'm probably going to complain about it. But when I was testing this in game, it actually worked pretty well. So I was really surprised that the sensor placement was okay. And now I think a large part of that also attributes to the shape and how I grip the mouse and where your fingers and your movements are based on when you're using it. So despite the further back sensor placement, in general, it actually worked surprisingly okay. So I'm not going to complain too much about it there, but some people don't like this, and I can see why. Now, obviously, I don't need to talk much about the sensor. You guys already know that the Razer optical sensor is one of the best available out on the market. It's nuts, so nothing to go off there. So for clicks, it is using the Razer optical switches. Those are patented. The clicks are very light, and they're not too crispy. So I think this is a problem with most optical switches on the clicks, that they aren't that nice and crispy to click down on. But I still do like the clicks on the Pulsar X2 Bruce Lee here better. Feels a lot more crispy, snappy, and takes a little bit more weight. However, these clicks perform insanely nuts on the Deathadder V3 in-game. The responsiveness is crazy high, like you click down and it just works, right? I'm not the biggest fan of how they feel, but in terms of raw performance and in-game, I don't really think about my clicks, obviously, but these just feel insanely well to play with because they're so responsive and they work magic. In terms of weight and weight distribution, this is a 63 gram mouse, which puts it in the same tier as the Superlight. However, considering how big this mouse is, 63 grams is very impressive for how well they built the mouse and the size of it. I think it would be very hard to get this any lighter than it already is without having to cut down on the build quality or something like that. Because it is a bigger Ergo, most of the weight is on the back of the mouse. That is to be expected. But the weight distribution is still insanely good. And as soon as you pick this mouse up, you start using it, you don't feel any sort of weight imbalance whatsoever. I mean, considering the way you would grip this mouse, it's to be expected that you wouldn't really feel any issues in terms of that. So stock skates, I'm not a big fan of the design of stock skates. As you guys would know, I like bigger, probably two solid patches on the front and the back of the mouse is my preferred type of skate. But in this case, they have done with a curved back and two corners up the front. So when I first looked at this, I was like, oh, that doesn't look too good. You know, such small skates for such a big mouse and all of that. But when I was playing in game, I had no base plate scratching whatsoever, which I was very surprised at, because normally when I play on an X-Soft Artisan Hayateotsu, not this mousepad you guys see on the table, I switched to main this recently, but I spend most of the time with the Hayateotsu on this Deathadder V3. Normally with any mouse that has corner feet, I would press down too hard and I get base plate scratching because skates are digging into the mousepad so much. But never happened with this. And I was like, what the hell is going on? Why is this not happening? Once again, that attributes back to the shape of the mouse and the way you would grip it, so we'll talk about that in the shape category. The stock skates worked surprisingly well on the mousepad. Lots of people have said it's really scratchy or they hated it. Mine worked perfectly fine on my Hayateotsu and on the Spy Loki. Obviously, I didn't have a break-in period with the skates because the mouse came used, so the stock skates were already broken in, so that could be a reason to why I didn't feel anything. Maybe if you guys got yours and you just used it for a super long amount of time, it would also smoothen out. I still replace them with core pads because I always do, and the core pads definitely do still feel better. That being said, the worn stock skates that I had were still very usable. Right, we'll move on to shape, which is the most important thing we have to talk about in terms of this mouse and its performance. Now, first of all, the thing you gotta know is this mouse is really big. However, the Zowie EC1 series is still bigger than this. And I also think the Zowie EC series is a superior ergo shape to this, regardless of your hand size, whether you get the EC2, EC3, or the EC1. This mouse is designed for palm grip, but you can also claw it. So palm grip and claw grip. Ideally, you probably don't want a fingertip on this thing, but I mean, if you like fingertipping everything and you also like mice, then maybe you could give this a go. The problem with this mouse is that the hump is really, really high on the middle, whereas the back slopes down super steep, and the front does too as well, which creates a thing where you have this big gap in the middle of your hand because you're really sloped back there and you're really sloped back there. So the entire midsection here is kind of rendered useless, and you don't really get that palm contact as you want to from a slightly lowered mid-hump mouse. Now, one thing you could do to counter this is by spreading your hand really wide so that you don't get that additional height around your knuckle area because you have to curl your hands in. So if you curl your hands in, your hands will naturally create more gap in the middle here. Whereas if you spread them out more, you can flatten more and you can get more grip on that. But then in this case, for my hands at least, this mouse isn't wide enough for me to spread my hands more to get that comfort ergo shape. The EC1 could, but this can't. So that's my most complaint about the shape. In the sense that if I want to palm grip this, I kind of can't really palm grip it the way I want to because I can't get my full hand resting on it properly or feeling comfortable. Especially for the ring finger and your pinky finger. These two fingers feel really off depending on how I grip the mouse. Which means I sort of resolve to like a hybrid claw palm. As soon as I pick up the mouse in terms of like a claw grip-ish feel, it just doesn't feel the way that you want a claw grip mouse to feel. I think hands that are slightly smaller than mine might be fine with this. They might find this to be the perfect size for their ergo. But I still do think the Zowie EC series is the superior in terms of shape. However, I still think this is the better mouse because the Zowie EC wireless series right now is still a bit too much. It's heavier, it's got worse internals and all of that. So all around, I still think this is probably the better choice. That being said, the Zowie is also perfectly usable if you're playing Counter-Strike or Valorant because you don't need to do a lot of raw aiming. Lighter weight is always going to be more beneficial for raw aiming. So if you're playing Overwatch, Apex, aim trainers, you will probably prefer this over the Zowie. The large ergonomic shape of this mouse also means that you get really bad micro adjustments. Because when the mouse is wide and the mouse is big and is palm filling, you can't do micros with your fingertips. Because micros come from the front of the mouse. You use your fingers to do the little micro movements and all of that, and you can't really get that on this mouse because it's so big. When I pick this mouse up and I go into this hybrid claw and my fingers are curled, I naturally want to do that movement via my fingertips because that's what you do with a claw grip mouse. The fact that I can't do this really puts me off in terms of performance. Now, the other thing to note is because the mouse is in that ergo shape, you're not really putting a lot of pressure onto the front of the mouse when you're pushing down. And that is also why I'm not getting base plate scratching. It's because my whole hand is resting on the mouse, my whole palm is there, a lot of the weight is therefore being pushed onto the back skate. And therefore, even though I feel like I'm pressing down hard on the front, the actual force on these two skates is very low, and it doesn't dig into the mouse pad as much as it would, which is why I didn't get that base plate scratching, despite only having these two corner skates, and I would get that on other mice. I'm not being able to do those micro adjustments because I'm not really using my fingertips, and therefore it's also not being pushed down a lot. The other flaw I can think of is, at least when I was playing games like Overwatch, or specifically Soldier 76, some of the Apex weapons that have high recoil, like the R99, or if you're in Valorant and I was using Vandal or Phantom or whatever, you're doing a short range burst and you gotta pull down the mouse. On mice like the X2 here, when I press down and I need to control the burst, I can curl my fingers in. I can't see if you guys see that, but as I'm holding the mouse in this resting position, I can curl my fingers in to try help with that recoil control, and I don't actually need to move my hand itself. However, on the DAV3, I don't have that room to move the mouse inside my hand itself, inside my already relaxed claw into aggressive claw for that pull down motion, because it's already being fully filled up and touching the back of my palm. If you do plan to convert into this mouse from something like the X2 or the whatever mouse you're using that you can do that curling motion in, you're going to find this really weird to do at the start, but once you get used to it, it will be perfectly fine. The advantage of a big, comfortable, stable mouse is that it's really good for angle holding. There is little to no stability issues. You get your crosshair placement right, you hold the mouse there and you just rest, and even if someone comes, you won't get that sudden tensing motion that messes with the mouse. So I occasionally used to get that with other mice, where I'm holding an angle, I'm relaxed, and as soon as someone comes, I tense up and I click down while I'm tensing, and then the mouse actually moves inside my hand, and that messes with the angle holding. That inability to move the mouse inside your hand is also a benefit in this case, because you won't accidentally mess up your angle hold and cause instability. I actually think this mouse is really, really good for playing Overwatch and Apex, in terms of being able to do large macro movements. Your big full-length swipes, you don't need to do lots of little micros in those games, as much as people don't believe, because most of the time you're tracking a character moving a super long amount of time and you can do big arm movements like this. A big comfortable mouse like this with all that stability is really, really good for doing these horizontal big movements as well as these vertical movements. The tracking on this, especially given that the sensor is really good, and if you had the 4K dongle, it'll move super nice, track super smooth, and perform excellently in those games. I do think though, in the terms of precision roll aim like you would in Valorant, it does fall off a little bit. That is why I'm still an X2 main, because in general I still play better on this mouse. This mouse is also really, really good for extended use. So if you're using a fingertip mouse or an aggressive claw mouse and you're permanently tensing your entire forearm, your hand to like hold it, that's going to cause you fatigue. You might not realize it's going to cause you fatigue, but after you play a certain amount of games or a certain amount of time, you're going to start really falling off in terms of your aim, because even though you're not feeling the fatigue, you are getting that fatigue. This mouse doesn't really give you any of that fatigue, so it'll be much better in terms of extended use, and that you can still continuously play without dropping off too hard. The final conclusion I can give this mouse is that it's arguably the best ergo mouse available on the market right now. Right, as much as I say I like the EC2 shape or the EC1 shape and just the Zowie EC series, I would still play with this simply because the lighter weight and the better tech specs are just putting this mouse as a much better performer. Given I haven't tried every single ergo mouse on the market, I think the X-Lite V2 and soon the X-Lite V3 look very promising as well. I do like that shape and the design based off the Elo shapes diagram. However, I feel like at least right now, all of those would be too small for my hands to use, and hopefully the large version of the X-Lite V3 might be more entertaining to me. My problem with the Deathadder is that it's not wide enough compared to the height it's at, and the Zowie EC1 is a much better width for my hands to use. I have pretty big hands because most people do complain about this mouse being far too big. It's insane how light this mouse is given its size, and I would recommend this for larger medium to large hands in general, and it's all around just a really good mouse. Right, there's not much for me to complain about it. Most of the things I talked about with the shape isn't inherently an issue of this mouse, but I feel like most ergos will have the same kind of problem. This is just a really good mouse. I can see why this is Boise's top pick, and I would definitely main this myself as well in some situations. In which case, I did main this for a bit of time and I played pretty well on it. Eventually went back to the X2 Bruce Lee, but you know, that's just me. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. If you can pick yourself up one of these, I highly recommend it. It is a very, very good mouse. I'll see you guys in the next one.